This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 458, Drupal and Next.js. This episode of Talking Drupal is sponsored by Hero Devs. On today's show, we are talking about Next.js, what it is, and how to integrate it with Drupal with our guest, John Albin Wilkins. We'll also cover Next.js Webform as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is John Albin Wilkins. John has been a web developer for 31 years, a Drupal developer for 20 years, a fully remote worker for 17 years, and a React developer for 7 years. He has given over 60 talks and keynotes in 4 continents. He is also a prolific sharer of free code. His Zen theme for Drupal 7 was downloaded over 1 million times. John, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are joining us for our second week, Patty Sonia Breitert, CEO and co-founder of 1X Internet. Welcome back to the show, and thank you for joining us. And also joining us, as usual, John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM.
Hello, Internet friends.
And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and recipes of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you ever wanted to build a web form in Drupal and have the corresponding Next.js template automatically created for you? There's a Next.js library for that. It's called Next.js Webform, and it was created in August of 2022 by Laurie Timoney, who listeners may know as the Drupal core product manager and one of the people leading the Starshot initiative. Does have test coverage, and for documentation, there's a lengthy README and a tutorial on the Acquia dev portal that we'll have a link to in the show notes. There are currently 17 open issues, 3 of which are bugs. And according to the NPM page, it has been downloaded 2,246 times per week. Now, using this library does require some setup on the Drupal side, including installing the Webform and Webform REST modules. There's also an extra patch to install if you want to use any autocomplete fields, and some configuration is needed for both the REST resources that will be used to exchange data and the permissions for the account that will be used to retrieve and submit data. Out of the box, the library supports over 40 Webform components. You can also provide custom elements if you need something else. The library also supports conditional logic, so fields can show or hide in the Next.js frontend based on conditions defined in your Drupal backend. The library also provides front-end validation for email confirmation, date list, and date time fields, but back-end validation is also processed for every submission. There is a crowded field of headless CMS competitors, but I thought this library is a good example of the extra power and flexibility you get by using a robust open source CMS like Drupal as the backend in your headless architecture. So let's talk about Next.js Webform.
My first question in any of these situations is always, how does the backend validation bubble up to Next.js? Because I imagine that's tricky. And I imagine Laurie thought about it, but I'm curious if you know the answer.
So I'm trying to recall, this is one I actually have used because I've used it in some demos for people comparing different headless CMS technologies. I imagine what happens is basically the front-end library knows to look for that as a potential response when submitting the web form, and then it would sort of, appropriately show whatever the error message is. I'm not sure if it'll actually highlight the field or any of that other stuff, but, I'm sure if that's something a project needed, you could probably open up a feature request for that.
Okay.
Yeah, the Json API responses include a way to specify that there are errors in the response. So I'm sure that I haven't actually used this module, but that's the way Json API works. So they would be showing web form errors in that response saying these are errors. And then it'd be up to the front end to read through that, figure out, which fields to highlight and all that stuff.
I have to say too, one of the things, this is a little tangential, but I feel like it's been a really long time since there's been an initiative in Drupal where every time we talk about something, I think, recipes is going to help out with configuring something like this so much. Recipes is just starting to get out into the wild for real, I think. I hope it lives up to my expectations because my expectations are so high. Everything I've seen says that it will meet those expectations. But yeah, like I'm just like this is a npm project, right? So the Drupal.org version is just for a place to kind of create issues. But I could see this being kind of a partner module for a recipe to do the kind of install and configuration for permissions and things. But yeah,
Not to be preachy, but Nick, it's open source. So even if it doesn't live up to your expectations, you can make it live up to your expectations.
It's the proverbial scratch your own itch phenomenon of open source, right?
There you go. Yeah, this is definitely very, very useful because when working with Drupal, there are plenty of people that are putting web forms on their sites, and sometimes they come up with custom solutions that may or may not work that great. But here's one that you can kind of just drop in there and get the right responses and have web forms on your site. So that's cool.
Yeah, I wanna like. There's more of those like popping up on Drupal.org at the moment, and Martin, I will send you a couple of more examples of like not for web forms but for Search API. There's like more of those examples where where I love that we have general projects on Drupal.org where we can actually put on these modules, and then there's like served by something else. So yeah, exciting.
I will say, I think, and I could be totally wrong about this, so fact check me where you will, but I feel like web forms was one of those modules that first kind of like had that like API integration, or was thinking kind of in a way where it's like, oh, somebody might want to use this headlessly one day. Like, let me build out like a way for that to be possible. Of course, this module just builds on top of that, I'm assuming, but
I mean, maybe other than Json API, but it's kind of silly to compare to Json API since that literally was the purpose of it. But your point is well taken.
Well, no, but I guess my point there was like, I think web form has the ability to, and this is totally going down a different path here, but I think web form has the ability to like copy code out of the back end and place it on your front end to like kind of get your web forms to work as well. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you, Martin. And as always, an on-topic module of the week. And if our listeners want to suggest one, what's the best way for them to suggest a module of the week?
We're always happy to get nominations for Module of the Week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as ManClue on all of the Drupal and social platforms.
Great. See you next week.
See you.
This episode of Talking Drupal is sponsored by Hero Devs. Let's talk about life after Drupal 7 end of life. Since August 2023, there's been a lot of discussion around Drupal 7's official end of life in January of 2025. It's no secret that many companies, organizations, and individuals are still on Drupal 7 and have yet to migrate. I think we can all agree that migration, while beneficial, is not always feasible, and this is where Hero Devs comes in. Hero Devs has partnered with core team maintainers of Drupal 7 to build and maintain the Drupal 7 never-ending support product, ensuring the same quality of support you have come to expect over the years. Drupal 7 never-ending support, or NES, allows for an effortless transition, allowing your site to remain secure, compliant, and compatible after Drupal 7 goes end of life. This allows you to migrate on your own time or potentially not at all. Hero Devs promises to keep Drupal 7 alive and well, even offering support for the current top 100 Drupal 7 modules. If you'd like to know more about Drupal 7 never-ending support, visit herodevs.com. That's HERODEVS.com. All right, John, let's start with maybe an easy question. What is Next.js and what is Next Drupal?
Right. So Next.js is a React framework. So React is the JavaScript tool that allows you to, build applications, on your front end. And Next.js is basically takes React, because React is very unopinionated, and Next.js is like, that's too flexible. That's like, you have to make all the decisions yourself. Let's decide some of those things for you, so you don't have to think about them, and we'll try to do them like the best way. And then everybody collaborates about how to do it the best way inside the Next.js framework. Right? So
Okay.
that's what Next.js is. And then Next Drupal then is like, well, how do we integrate the Next.js framework with Drupal backend? So Next Drupal is a JavaScript tool to do queries inside Next.js to the Drupal backend using Json API or GraphQL.
So for those that may not be, familiar with Next.js, right? So is Next.js like almost like a runtime for React apps? Is that kind of like how you could call it, or is it like a server orchestration tool for React apps? Like, how would you kind of like classify it, I guess, for somebody that's like, I don't know, just listening to this from outside of the React or the JS framework space?
Well, since I'm a Drupal developer, I'm going to give a Drupal analogy.
Yeah, that's the best kind.
Yeah. Like you can write your own theme using twig.js, right? Or you can use a base theme, which has all the stuff pre-set up, to the starting point already set up, right?
Okay.
Using React is kind of like, I'm just going to build a theme from scratch using Twig. And
Okay.
using Next.js is like, I'm going to use a very popular, community maintained starter kit for, Drupal. That's basically what Next.js is. It's got a bunch of stuff already set up for you, so you don't have to make those same decisions.
Is it kind of like Symfony to Drupal? Like React is Symfony, Drupal is Next? Or is it like is that not a good analogy at all?
I think it is hard to compare, right?
That could work. I mean, there are definitely specific React components that are written by Next.js that are available, right? And they're using the React code that's like lower level, right? So there's a little bit of analogy there for that as well. That you could say that. So like Next.js is built on React's code base.
So like the way I kind of think about it is like more from a server perspective, right? So like Next.js doesn't just run on any sort of server, right? You need to be running Node on your server in order for Next.js to kind of like work and do what it needs to be doing, right?
Yeah. That's what the sysadmins tell me. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So like the way I look at like Next.js, and this is probably going to confuse people, so I apologize, but like in order to run a PHP app on your server, you need to have, PHP installed, right? So like on your Node server, if you have Next.js, you now have the ability to kind of run React apps on your server, and Next.js, excuse me, provides you with like an extra layer there to be able to do some cool things like server-side rendering and other kind of like server-side processing of stuff.
Yeah. There's a lot to say about server-side rendering, but we can get to that later.
Yes, true. So like, yeah, so I think that probably gives folks enough to at least do a Google search to hear what other folks have to say about it.
Yeah, so I'm actually curious, like if we are keeping it a little bit on a higher level at the moment, talking about what is it, how is it used on the web today? Why do you build an application using Next and not just do it differently? How is it used on the web today, if I can ask it like that?
Yeah, I've actually built Next.js apps that don't have Drupal in the backend at all. They're just front-end applications that consume different APIs that are available on different services, right? I've had a client who has their own products set up through an API. I think it was Json API, but it was a custom built JSON API endpoint that was for their products. and then just use Next.js to query that endpoint and show results for customers. That would using authentication and all of that stuff is
Would you say it would be would you say it was much quicker to build it that way than like, is that the reason why you would choose that way of implementing it?
The great thing about a front end system like this is that you can integrate with a lot of different APIs all at the same time quickly, because it's a single. I don't know how to describe this, because it used to be so that it was only running in the front end, right? So all your JavaScript would be connected to different APIs and pulling data and just sort of integrating it sort of seamlessly inside the browser, right? Now with server-side rendering, the same thing happens, but it just happens on the node server instead of, or at least some of it happens on the node server before it goes to the web browser, but some of it is still done in the web browser. So, and being able to sort of decide which things get done on the server and which things get done on the server in the web browser is a new feature of Next.js that it's really, really easy to implement. And so it's easy to decide which things get done where. Right?
So you had mentioned that this is built on top of React. So is it just purely React? Like you can't integrate with any other JavaScript frameworks, or is it React?
That's right. Next.js is dependent on React.
Okay, that makes sense.
I'm actually curious a little bit. Can I we're always talking about accessibility, and I'm a little bit thinking now out loud. So like having all of these JavaScript frameworks, applications, how is it like affecting, when we're doing web vitals and all this stuff, like, turn off all the JavaScript, turn off everything that could be interfering, is that like solved somehow nice with Next.js, that there's these components coming with it that is helping with those type of situations? Or I don't know what lingo I should be using, but do you know anything about that in terms of like, accessibility audits? Like, are these, because the performance is definitely high, it's quick, right? But what's your experience in that field?
My experience with accessibility in React applications is similar to what it is in any other web projects that I've done. Right. It depends on where you get your source material and how committed you are to accessibility. Right. And React is not necessarily any worse than Drupal or vice versa as far as accessibility. I mean, I love the sort of dedicated accessibility people in Drupal, and it's a little bit harder to find those people in React, but that's probably just because I know the Drupal community so well. And I say that you have to learn what reusable components are actually accessible, and not just somebody slapped the word accessible on the homepage of this new component that you can download that does widget X thing, right?
Yeah.
So you just have to be careful about choosing which things that you want. There's a lot of components that are reusable inside the React world, and because Next.js is dependent on React, anything that can be done in React can be done with a Next.js application as well. Right. So all those React components are available for a Next.js app.
Cool.
Interesting. So, because this is a Drupal podcast and we've talked a lot about Next.js for the first, 20 minutes or so, I'm wondering, why would someone integrate Next.js with Drupal?
Right. I'm going to give you my path to this, to finding Next.js, coming from a theme developer, right, for Drupal 7, right? I was the primary maintainer developer of Zen theme, and one of the really nice things about it was a theme that was designed for beginners, but also for expert people. And the way that it did that was, it would do a lot of the expert things for you, and you would just sort of learn as you go and take over the bits as you learned it. And then when Drupal 8 happened, I started to port it to the Zen theme, to Drupal 8, and I kind of got stuck really quick because at the same time I was trying to implement sort of ideas of components into the Zen theme at the same time of porting to Drupal 8. And in order to do components well inside Drupal with Twig, it becomes really difficult really fast because you don't get sort of clean data. All of the theme hooks that were part of Drupal 7's PHP template are still there under Twig. And if I want all the code for a node, there's like 18, 19 20 different pieces of render array stuff that specifies where the data is coming from. And some of it's like lazy loaded, so you don't know. It was really hard for me to like build a Drupal 8 Twig starter kit that was easy for beginners. I was like, I'm building an expert system now instead of a beginner system. I was like, I just gave up because I was like, maybe somebody else will figure out how to do better. So I just started experimenting with all sorts of stuff. And about that time, people were talking about decoupled stuff. So I started learning about React. And when I first started doing React, there was a lot of stuff you had to do by hand setting up. We had this like total custom handmade thing that did the entire app. And it was really wobbly because only one person knew how to set it up and fix stuff that would get broken. And then I found Next.js. And it's been around a while. And it's a really stable framework that does all this stuff for you. It's constantly been getting better. Yeah, I picked Next.js to do the front end of my Drupal themes, not because Twig is bad, but because render arrays were still there. I actually quite like Twig, but the render arrays made it really hard to get data out the way that I needed in order to do component design.
So it sounds like if I synopsize what you just said, and it's super interesting to hear your path to Next and Drupal, because I think your path is probably one that a lot of people have, right? It's one of like getting into the Twig theming system, or back in the day PHP templates, right? And being like, whoa, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of things going on here just to make like one element appear on a page, right? And Next.js with React allows you to kind of componentize that and, for lack of better terms, clean up that markup to make it very streamlined and very specific to what you need it and want it to do, right? Kind of creates that split or that divide as to what Drupal does best, which is content structure and serving structured content well via API. And then you're kind of moves your theme out into Next.js, where you have more control, I guess, or it makes it a little bit easier to kind of maintain and streamline your code, potentially even reusing it quite a bit. Is that something that I kind of heard there as a benefit, maybe?
Because there's lots of components that you can find for React. But find me a Twig-based component library. Name one.
Yeah.
There aren't any.
Yeah,
not that I know of. I looked for a while.
And it's tough. I think with single directory components in some of the starshot stuff, I think eventually Drupal will start providing a way to have kind of component libraries that are Twig based, because you can kind of have a self-contained YAML file, Twig, CSS, and JS, and all you need to know is what inputs are expected and include it. And that's actually cleaned up a lot of implementation. But the issue that you just discussed is still something that I struggle with today. Like I'm working on a project right now where I'm more in a consulting role, and the main developer he's a really talented backend developer, but he's not super familiar with Drupal. He's probably one of the most talented front-end developers I've ever worked with. I mean, he's just fantastic, but again, not familiar with Drupal. And I think the biggest stumbling block, that the thing that we keep coming back to, is the difference between like the node object and the content render array, and when to use one versus the other, and how to make sure that you don't bypass the cache if you're just grabbing values directly, and what pre-process hooks are. And like I said, he's really talented, so he's picking it up. But a lot of our discussion is around that. So yeah, it's still not. I don't. I was gonna say it's not a solved problem today, but it's not. It's not really a problem. It's just the way that Drupal does things, and there's good reasons that Drupal does it that way. But sometimes when you're coming at it from a purely front end perspective, it's sometimes confusing why you have to dig into 17 arrays to get to the value if you're in the render array.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's sometimes tough.
I actually wrote a module called Form Dazzle that all it does is like goes through the render array for you and like adds what is it? It's theme hook suggestions to every single part of the form. So like,
oh, interesting.
So they're like specifically named, suggestions for every single like label and like all the entries. Just like
there's now
because it's really hard to go through the render array and do stuff.
I'm gonna have to check that out. I know Twig Suggest does a lot of that too, but I don't know if it does it for every single value. I'll have to compare that. That's pretty cool.
This is just for forms, just the one thing, forms.
Yep. So one thing I'm curious about when we talk about any kind of decoupled solution is content updates and caching and that kind of thing. How does Next.js know that content has changed on the Drupal side?
Smoke semaphores mostly. The primary way that that editors are going to interface with this is that when you're editing the piece of content, right, in the Drupal side, there is a so I should point out that the Next Drupal, it's not just I think I described it slightly. I described it slightly smaller than it actually is. It is the integration point between the Next.js app and the Drupal backend, but there's actually Drupal modules that go with it too that add on extra features. So it's not just interfacing with Json API from core.
Okay.
And so there's some things you have to configure inside those Drupal modules. And one of the features you get is that you can tell those modules, hey, can you, since you're not using the front end of Drupal to show any content, what do we display on the node page, right? And what it will do is it'll show an iframe of the actual front end site. So after you're editing it and you save it, it goes back to like the node page, and that'll be an iframe of the front end site. It'll actually it can show different revisions of that content. So you just specify what revision you want to see, and it will send a special message to the front end saying, hey, I want you to show me the draft version of this, and here's like our secret handshake, and give it this revision ID when you actually render it. So it'll do a special render just for the content editors inside their iframe that nobody else can see.
So you're basically just saying that, if you're using the Next.js module and, all that, what is behind it, you're just getting all of this, like, that you would otherwise have to build completely yourself. Like, I was looking at the next-drupal.org site, and, there's a lot of mentioning of previews that, like, so it is not that Next.js is solving the previews, like it's you guys that are creating these modules, is that you are actually creating this problem of how do you do previewing in Drupal with the Next.js app. Am I understanding it correctly?
Yes, that's right. So Next.js has this idea of draft mode, which is specifically for a generic solution for CMSs in general. And then Next Drupal has Drupal modules that are solving it specifically for Drupal using the Next.js draft module feature.
Okay.
That's cool.
So you just mentioned something that triggered a question for me. Then is if you're publishing stuff in Drupal, saving stuff in Drupal and it's not publishing, is Next.js a static app or is it a single page app or is it both?
It's both, right? It can be whatever you want.
Okay.
React has a very new feature that most people don't know about, called client rendering or server rendering. Or I should say client components or server components. And the reason why most people don't know about it is because if you just use React and you don't use a framework, you cannot use those features. They're not available. And because how do you render React on the server? Well, it depends on what framework you're using. So the React developers are working with framework developers to implement React server components and client components in the frameworks. So, so the frameworks are actually using it's like a beta version of React. So you use a real version of Next.js official release that tells your node build system to actually use a specific version of React that has this very cutting edge feature.
So
server components, so server rendering.
So my analogy of React being Symfony and Drupal being Next.js then is backward. Like that's so bizarre to me that the framework is built on top of the system rather than the system being like, you would think that React would be the framework is usually the most underlying system, but Next.js sounds like it provides a lot more glue. That's interesting.
Yeah.
That
So
feels backwards.
when you're developing it, you're on your command line, right? You're running Next.js commands essentially to get your development server running. So that's all Next.js stuff, and it's using React to do that. And then Next.js also has its own components which are using React code. So it's like this, I don't know.
They're like codependent on each other, basically.
Yes, they are. Codependency is a great way to say it. Yeah.
So one thing we talked about kind of early on in the show, I want to dig into it a bit more, is the server-side rendering. So first of all, tell us what server-side rendering is, and then if we can explain why it's important.
Right. So one big problem with traditional React apps is that they're JavaScript only applications, and that means that when you would go to a web page, you would download all of the JavaScript you would need, and then all the data, and then you would render it all inside the browser. And surprise, sometimes that can be a little slow. There are a lot of tricks to make it as fast as possible, but it turns out if you pre-render some of that stuff, it's even faster, right? So like if you can make it so it's like a static build, but then you add some JavaScript onto just sort of sprinkle some JavaScript on the top, that's way faster than downloading all the JavaScript and then rendering. So server-side rendering is essentially that. It is, okay, how do we tell the application, I'm going to render some of these things on the server statically. So I'm going to do all the queries to like Drupal backend or whatever API I want on the server, render it to an HTML file with a little bit of JavaScript attached to it, and then send that to the browser. And then React does this thing called rehydration, where it doesn't really important what it actually does, but it basically understands the DOM from a React standpoint by rehydrating, and then it can manipulate anything in the DOM again at that point.
I saw a little bit about this recently, and I think it's funny that it's almost like they went full circle, yes, it's more efficient to pre-render something once at the server and just serve that to the browser than to just ship 8 megabytes of JavaScript to the client and have them.
This is literally how we started development in 1993 when I got started. You would render everything on the server, right?
So it's a little bit more. There are more areas there than just performance, right? So like obviously server-side rendering a page on the server, building the page on the server is more performant because your CDN can then pick that up and distribute it very quickly to the end user with those little areas of dynamic kind of React content, right? But there's another aspect here too, I would imagine, of like search engine optimization, right? Because if you were not to server side render your React, app or site, right, you would then get penalized with like, hey, you're downloading a bazillion JavaScript files, and I can't really read this page because I'm not necessarily building the page as a front end user, right? So like I think there are other problems server side rendering can solve. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there were all sorts of tricks that people were doing to try to get it to be the best, on Google scores or rated performance, but some of those become obsolete because of server-side rendering.
Nice. Now, there's a lot of features of Drupal, but there's two particular features of Drupal that I understand are particularly difficult to implement in decoupled. And people that work in decoupled, I think, would really like to integrate more closely with how Drupal works. And those are views and menus. How does Next.js interact with Drupal views and Drupal menus?
So there is one of the modules you can do is a menu specific Drupal module that serves the actual menus. Because if you've ever used just Json API core and looked at the menus, it is not what you want because Json API sorts all of its data by resource types, but menus are this special weird thing where sometimes they're custom menu items, which is a resource type, and then sometimes they're like hard-coded paths. And like it's this whole mixture, and this tree is outside of the list of custom menu items. So if you get a list of custom menu items, you don't have the whole menu. You can't get the whole menu. So it's very frustrating to try to look at that. So there's another module that will actually, you ask, say, can I please have the actual main menu? And then you get that, right? Yeah. So it's quite handy.
Does that, out of curiosity, does that work with the menu API stuff that Brian Perry's doing? Like, is that how that works, or does it just do it on its own?
You mean the JavaScript menu initiative?
Yes, that is the thing that I am talking about. Thank you, Nick, for providing that very important context.
I think it closed down.
We are finished. I was part of that.
Yeah. Oh, so why don't you speak to it? We shipped it. You shipped it? Okay.
We shipped it.
So does the Next.js module use that work to provide those endpoints to Next.js, or is there something else going on? I guess would be the question.
I haven't looked at the stuff that came from the menu initiative, unfortunately.
That is a totally acceptable answer.
I can ask the next difficult question, because I always get this. I'm going to change topic a little bit now, because we are. So, is there any preference on the API side? Meaning, like okay, Json API. I think Next.js for Drupal is using Json API, or correct? Is that correct, John?
So there actually is a GraphQL version of it.
Okay, so that's going to be the question.
Primarily focused on the Json API stuff.
Yeah. So what I often hear, and what I hear maybe some of my colleagues talking about, is like, hey, GraphQL is like more widely adopted, and like the developers who are actually then doing the Next.js applications, they are like just more used to all this stuff. Like, would you say that is there any preference? Do you have a personal preference? Maybe you answered it. Does Next.js for Drupal have a special preference? You said that you were delivering it for both. Any opinion on that, or am I going into a difficult path here? Either or.
So next Drupal, that project, have some beta releases for the 2.0 release. Those are specific to new features in Next.js around server rendering. and we're still working on that and updating the docs actually. And inside that, we have abstracted some of our code so that you can do the JSON API and the GraphQL stuff are sort of separated. And you can pick one or the other. And the GraphQL is a little bit more experimental than the JSON API one is.
You mean then do you then mean it for
inside the next Drupal project itself?
Okay.
The GraphQL one is a little bit more experimental, but there are people who, and the only reason why we've done that is because we would like to get more contributors saying this is the way we like to do GraphQL, so that we can like finalize that and make it more solid. But right now it's like, it's, here's how you can do it, using GraphQL. But we would just like to see some best practices added in before we like say this is the official GraphQL, client from the next Drupal project. Yeah. So do I have a preference? I mean, like JSON API is more supported inside Next Drupal, right?
Yeah.
I also really like GraphQL. I used that for like 6 years as well. So.
Because I think it is interesting, like, now I'm coming from Europe, and we see like the applications that are being built in Europe, and there's a lot of like headless applications being built in Europe with Drupal. And, these are the questions that I ask, like, are you using the JSON API, or are you using GraphQL, or are you using paragraphs, or are you using layout builder? Like, and there's always like these nice conversations that come with those questions. And I feel like the European community has been, or at least in the camps that I've been attending, there's just a lot of talks around GraphQL, and there's a lot of like extra modules, like the explorers, stuff that you can do, that you can make it a bit easier for you as a developer to build Next.js applications. So
there's actually a Next Drupal starter kit that uses Next Drupal as a dependency that is specifically geared towards GraphQL, right? So they've and one of the, I think it's Wonder.io, and so they're in Europe, and they're doing GraphQL stuff with Next Drupal, right? And then Chapter 3 in the US, they're doing a lot of stuff with the JSON API stuff, and they're the ones who sponsored a lot of my work to work on Next Drupal these last few months.
I always feel like it's nice. I don't know, better. Better's probably not the best term, right? Like, but I always feel like it's nicer to stick to core as much as possible. But I like the fact that there are options for folks who want to go down the GraphQL road to be able to do that, with whether a submodule or another module altogether, right? Like, I feel like that's, I don't know, that's the right way to do it, I guess.
Yeah, is it? But I think I would love to, like, I think there could be we could actually do a podcast about just these type of.
Like, absolutely.
Talking about what is better, where's or different, or.
I'm quite impressed with the GraphQL modules, the new ones. I think they need to update their homepage on Drupal.org because it's really hidden. But there's like this new feature that allows you to like. To just with some user interface, some admin forms on Drupal, you just like click. I want to expose this kind of data inside GraphQL queries. So then you like select the entities and all the fields that you want, and then like it builds the schema for you. Because like the default way is like, oh, you just write some PHP code or something. It's way too hard for me in order to build your schema. And I'm like, I don't want to do that.
You can kind of build it with like displays almost, it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. And it's maybe it's not the most like pretty schema, but like it's super easy to set up. And then like maybe the schema is a little Drupal-y. It's not Render API. It's way better than that. So
I feel like we might have missed a question early on, and so I'm curious. You mentioned you kind of started looking around because of the Render API, render arrays, and things had changed so much in Drupal 8. But I'm curious.
Well, Render API came with Drupal 7, but anyway, yes.
Oh yeah. But with the new wave, like it became more prominent, I think, in Drupal 8. But
yes,
one of the things that I'm curious about is, what kinds of things are you able to do in Next.js that you can't easily do in Drupal, other than kind of like the component piece? Like, does it allow you to make things a little bit flashier, easier? Does it allow you to make more interactive apps? Like, what kinds of things are you actually building? Because I imagine you're actually building client sites with this. What kinds of projects are you building with this today that that continue to send you back to Next.js?
So I haven't yet used the single directory components yet, but before that, adding in some JavaScript to do something was a lot of coordination with a lot of different files spread out all over the place inside the theme, right? So you had to like add something to the .info file or the .libraries file, right? And then you had to write a library that pointed at the JavaScript file that was a separate file, and then you had there was a lot of different pieces, and they were all in different directories, and it made it harder to just like go in write one little thing, and then the JavaScript had to be. There's a lot of conventions inside Drupal's JavaScript of like making sure that it works with everything else, but that means that you have to write it in a very specific way, and that's not the way that most people write JavaScript anymore, right? It will, like the Drupal way of writing JavaScript will make sure that everything gets updated when you have like content that gets like lazy loaded within Drupal. So like Drupal can do lazy loading at different parts of your pages. And as long as you keep writing your JavaScript, that is this old way of making sure that I can't even remember what it's called. I haven't done it in so long.
Behaviors.
Thank you. Yeah. So as long as you're using Drupal behaviors, Drupal will make sure that those behaviors will run on any bit of content that gets loaded either with Ajax or lazy loading or whatever. As long as Drupal knows that new content is coming in, that behavior will run, right? But it's a certain specific sort of constrained way of writing JavaScript, right? And it makes it really hard to integrate with other different JavaScript libraries. And React is a JavaScript library. So like you just start writing JavaScript wherever you want in order to do these integrations. And it's way faster and more natural. Yeah.
I mean, that's some of the reason why I've been doing more work with just native web components too, right? So because when you want to change the behavior, like it's still, the nice thing is it's still in Drupal because you're making the native web component a library in Drupal, but it's just JavaScript. So if you need to change the behavior of a particular component, you just write native JavaScript, and it makes it
nice.
It's really nice. And single directory components so far seem to make it easier to then integrate. Like it adds an extra layer actually, but makes it easier to integrate as well. There's a lot less logic in the twig template. You're just including the single directory component. So and to the second part of my question, like what kinds of applications are you able to write then? Or are you just like anytime you have a Drupal project, it's going to be Next.js?
I mean that's what I do. So like I work for companies that do that. So I kind of don't make those decisions.
I can absolutely help with that.
Okay.
No, like it's like the decision making on like when do you choose to do it like that and when not. And I think like it really depends on the, like very often we use, for example, we work with design agencies that actually have front-end developers that do maybe some of the stuff, right? So like there's like a large organization that wants to like throw out a microsites and stuff like that. Like that's a perfect example of something that like where you want to integrate other developers in or developers from the company. I don't know if you have experience with that, John.
Yes,
like,
actually, yeah.
And then also like I think like everything that needs to be snappy and like everything that is interactive. Like I think that we are building like these customer portals or like portals for some applications. Like everything that needs to be a little bit like I write something, I press enter, and then it's just like it appears, right? It's such a perfect use cases for when to use this.
And clients are also looking for making sure that they build a website that a lot of developers know how to like modify or make better. Like there's a lot more React developers than there are Drupal front end developers. A lot more.
So one thing that comes to mind here, we've talked about Next.js and React and the integration with Drupal and how Next.js has a lot of benefits for performance, especially around server-side rendering, right? I'm wondering if there's any downside. It all sounds so good. I'm wondering what the downside is, right? So one thing that I think comes to mind for me is like, performance concerns. Like, do you think Next.js is probably better for smaller scale websites with less content, or could it handle a large scale website with, thousands of pieces of content, maybe like a product catalog for an e-commerce store, or, a very popular blog, or even maybe like a open source software that has like an issue queue with millions of issues in it?
Well, I think that John from Chapter 3 would be very disappointed if I don't mention the fact that Chapter 3 is currently working on a project that is a huge content website. I can't say the name of it because it hasn't been released yet. It's coming up this next month. But it is a huge scale website. So watch their blog. I'm sure that they will be talking a lot about it for a long time. One of the great things about the new server side rendering parts is that you can render a lot of a large site pre-render all of that. So it may take a while to like batch that, but like that's a batch that's done to pre-build those things. It's not something that running all the time, right? So
and then through the magic of caching, I imagine that it becomes very, very performant.
Yeah, exactly, right. And then if you're talking about something like commerce sites, with commerce sites, I would say like Drupal has a bunch of different commerce modules, commerce Drupal modules, and there are a lot of existing APIs and existing services for commerce that are outside of the Drupal world.
Sure.
And integrating with those inside a decoupled site is really easy. So you can have some of your content in Drupal, and then your products are in some service for products, and you just like smush them together inside your Next.js app, and
kind of like what we were talking about earlier, where you server side render one part, the page, right? But then it has dynamic bits, and those dynamic bits can kind of come from a lot of different sources, it sounds like.
Yep. So
fabulous.
Cool. And if we change one of my favorite topics is editorial experiences. So the editor on the website using Drupal, hopefully a really nice admin theme, and it's like working on the content. Yes, we talked earlier about previews that you can see a little bit it, but still there is still a disconnect between like I want to create a add in a component that is a text component or something, and then actually how it is going to display. Do you have anything? So there's a lot of modules out there that I feel like that they're trying to solve this problem. Is there anything in Next Drupal that is solving this, the editorial experience on the Drupal site?
Yes and no, I guess would be the best way to just say that. So like I did some investigations because I was looking at Layout Builder, because Layout Builder has a fairly nice editorial experience. None of that data is exposed to the Json API, which means it's a no-go for building an app. You can't get the blocks out as a I want all of the Layout Builder blocks as a single JSON API response. Like that there just isn't a response that does that. Really kind of problem. So all of the sites that I've used are continuing to use paragraphs because of that. So any paragraphs specific, like make the editor experience thing better, would work with this as well. But since we're doing React rendering, some of them may not apply either, right? Because I think some of those editor experience things are like, oh, I'm just gonna like grab the front end theme from Drupal
like
and
layouts
render
paragraph.
But like there's no front end theme. So those things wouldn't work. So the back end actual editing of the content will still be a little bit abstract. It's just important to like not make your paragraphs so nested that they're like hard to understand, right?
Correct.
That's the key, and I think that's the key with any time you use paragraphs or
I think
even
this is
layout builder.
Yeah, and I think this is interesting what you say, because this is also here based on my experience, again, like in companies that I listen to, and also in my own company. That's exactly how you're describing it, John, how we are also doing things. And because the editorial experience, like we can give, we can even give flexibility that then gets into the, that gets rendered then in the Next.js app. So it's pretty cool.
Not to be contrarian here, but I am currently working on a headless Drupal site that is using Layout Builder to lay out pages and serving that out to Next.js. So it is possible. I think there was a custom normalizer built.
I was going to say, there's going to be a lot
there
of work
somewhere. So it's not exactly plug and play like some of the out of the box solutions, but have developer will travel, I guess is the motto there. So you can do it. It just might take a little bit of engineering.
And things might have changed too, because I remember the first site I built with Layout Builder, we built it for a course module, like a course site, so you could take lessons, and each layout section, they wanted to make sure that people completed them in order. So you'd have to say, like, I completed this section, it would open the next section, and then it would store which section had been completed, so it knew the next time you visited which ones should be open because they were completed and which ones should be closed. And even just like that concept took a lot of custom work to figure out. Like, there's no concept of these are the blocks that we're rendering, or the sections we're rendering in the order. Like, it kind of just comes fully baked. But now that JSON is a first class like type in like MySQL, I think in Drupal 11 there's going to be some huge improvements to how Layout Builder works, because I think they're planning on just storing it as JSON. Although who knows, that might take a couple of years.
Anybody that's watched the show before knows I love Layout Builder.
Yeah.
I used to love paragraphs. I still think, like, I'm not saying like people that use paragraphs are, doing it wrong. It's just different flavors.
Hey, do you remember on DrupalCon there was this session always about like front end against back end, and there was this like it was Adam Duran and like the name goes away immediately. I know him really well though. So they were doing this like fight. And I always I would love to do that type of let's just go on the stage, do Layout Builder stuff and paragraph stuff, and try to do the same thing and just see like where do we have the cool things. And I think it's going to be a nice session to have.
I would love to have like a little table just off to the side where I'm using like Drupal 4.6 in Flexy Node in order to try to do the same thing.
Yeah, it's Campbell. It's, by the way, Adam Duran and Campbell. That I don't want to, if you remember seeing those sessions. But talking about Next.js.
Now I'm trying to think back to Drupal 4 and remember what that was like, and I don't feel like I want to do it. I feel like
the field API didn't exist, right? Like, didn't you have to use CCK to like create your own?
Yeah, well, Flexy Node was before CCK.
Really? I've never used Flexy Node. I didn't know that. That's so funny.
Was field A? It was the field API in when back 4.5. When was that? Yeah, Google that. I can see him doing it already.
CCK was the original field API essentially, and that was a trip module. And I'm afraid to answer that.
I want to say 7, but I'm afraid. Yeah. I'm afraid to say that because if I'm wrong. I think it came out in 7.
Yeah, you might be right. I'm terrible with dates. All right, let's focus back in.
I just thought of something. We were talking about editorial experiences, and I was just thinking about paths, because one of the things that's not quite so obvious is how much editorial control do you give over the editors being able to control all of the paths, right? Because you can build an application in Next.js in React that queries for that data, gets the full path, and then renders the front end using the exact same paths. But there's without server rendering, there's a little problem there, because if you're trying to do it on the front end, you have to load the entire JavaScript base for any possible different component for any kind of content, because you don't know when you go to that path on the front end, it doesn't necessarily, it's basically handled by a wildcard component that goes, I don't know what kind of thing this is. Let's query the backend and see what it is. And then the backend says, oh, it's this thing. But because JavaScript is statically, aggregated, it has to aggregate all of the different kind of contents that might be rendered into the bundle so that it can render the one thing that you actually need for this path.
Yeah.
Which can really mess up your bundle sizes if you allow full control over URLs. If you're doing only front end rendering. If you do server side rendering, all that problem goes away because none of that code goes to the browser.
What do you use for your build process? What do you use for bundling? Do you use Webpack or Rollup or something else?
Next.js has a bundler that's included with it. Wow, I can't remember. I'm blanking on. They used to use Webpack. I have a feeling though that they might have updated to a new. I can't say it's been a few months since I looked at it, because that's one of the things. Like, it's made the decision for me. I don't have to think about it again. So I haven't actually looked at what it was in 6 months.
Fair enough.
So I don't have to configure it. Yay!
It's the name of the game,
configuration
right?
is the worst.
The least amount of configuration, the better, right?
Yes.
One thing that comes to mind, John, is images, right? And handling images. Like, Drupal does a really good job of creating derivatives and managing responsive image styles and doing all of that stuff, right? And from my experience with other things, not necessarily Next, but integrating with other systems and platforms, like, typically responsive image styles and responsive images don't kind of migrate nicely to some front end frameworks. Wondering if Next.js has the ability to kind of pull in responsive images from Drupal, or if there's some sort of best practices you can share with us as to how to get those responsive images to work well with Next.js.
One of the things I almost wish that the Json API endpoint would be like, for responsive images, I'm not going to give you the data. I'm just going to render the markup for you. I wish it did that, but that technically violates the Json API. So it just gives you the data about the responsive image. So then you have to figure out what the markup should be yourself. So you can do that. I've done that. It's a lot, right? Because usually, I should say I've done it with very specific ways that I've configured the responsive images on the Drupal side, right? Because if I wanted to have a general purpose interpreter of the data that I'm going to get about responsive API or responsive images in the front end, it would have to be super flexible, and there would be a lot of code, and I just never thought that was worth it, right? So if I configure it a specific way, I know it's not because you can have a picture element, or sometimes you just have an image element with a bunch of attributes on it, and Drupal knows which one to do depending on the configuration, but I don't want to have to figure that out on the front end. It's just
and most people, the way that they use the responsive system in Drupal is they say hey, this is a hero image at 1,000 pixels, generate an image that's this size, at 2,000 to this size. But you could also be like, hey, I want you to provide a PNG, a WebP, and an AVIF, and I want you to provide 2x for Retina and 5x for the crazy Retina upscale stuff, for each breakpoint. So then you end up with this, a picture element that's 6,000 characters long. And if you were to try to build that based on the attributes that come back over, I would never want to do that.
So I have a dumb question. And maybe Nick, based on your previous
I
comment,
haven't finished answering the first question you asked. Is this a related random question?
Yeah.
Or?
it is. Yeah, it is.
Okay,
It
go
is
on.
totally. It's kind of like additional information because I'm unclear, right? So like JSON API, when it returns an image and there are derivatives of it, does it return all of the paths to all the derivatives?
Yes, it does. But you have to configure that.
Sure.
JSON API extras, I think, can allow you to pick which derivatives you actually want to be sent over to your Next.js side.
Okay, cool. Okay, that was a point of clarification I was not clear on. Thank you.
So yeah, so to continue the what's the best way to do that? If you have a very specific idea of a sort of minimalist way that you're going to do responsive images inside the Drupal configuration, then you can look at the JSON API response after you configure it and saying, I want these specific, image source sets, whatever. Then you can look at the data and then it becomes sort of straightforward. I like having Drupal render it once and then like copying and pasting and then just swapping out the actual data with my JavaScript variables. That's probably the easiest way to do it that way. The other thing that you can do is you just grab the original source path for that image from Drupal and then send it to the Next.js image component to do the resizing for you. That will depend on some server configuration. I think, it definitely works with Vercel's platform. They're the ones who wrote Next.js. So they have like specific tools to make sure that all that stuff gets done on your server when you request those things. So probably you can work with other servers, but I don't actually know how to do that. So.
I'm curious. This is somebody who hasn't written any decoupled from scratch. I've worked on decoupled projects before, definitely. But I mean, you mentioned that if you just get the rendered thing back from JSON API, that breaks JSON API kind of contracts generally. But have you ever considered just having like a separate API endpoint where you can just be like, here's a file ID that I want, and here's the responsive style I want, and just let it give you the rendered HTML back? So it makes a second round trip, but you just...
So here could be a problem with that. And this was going to be, I have a full of questions. So I like with images though, right? Because you're potentially server-side rendering, right? You don't necessarily know the viewport size, right? So like, wouldn't you
don't need to.
Oh, nope. John shaking his head. No, go ahead.
Yep. You don't need to. So with the responsive image markup, you actually specify all the different possible paths and the breakpoints in the HTML markup.
Right.
So
in the picture tag, right?
Or the image source.
Yeah. So you don't need to know the viewport.
Yeah. So you don't need to know. It's the browser that figures out which one am I actually going to download.
Got it. Okay. Sorry, Nick. So what were you saying?
Yes. Have you ever just considered having a separate endpoint where you can just pass the file and the responsive size back and get that HTML back? Or is that so you're kind of like a separate API or no?
So I haven't considered it for images specifically, but there's a decoupled router module that does not follow the JSON API standard, which is kind of important for building Next.js sites, in my opinion, because the JSON API, and I don't understand the logic of why it breaks JSON API, but like if you were like, hey, I've got this path, Drupal, can you give me the content for this path? And for some reason you can't, because JSON API says you have to give me this, 18 character long ID for it, not the path. So you have to like do this thing to query for the... Anyway, decoupled router essentially breaks. It's not really a JSON API response. It's a JSON API-like response that actually gives you what you need when you give it a path.
Okay.
Throw a dam into that, and you're everything's getting crazy, right?
Yeah, I like that.
So it's a JSON response, right? And it looks like JSON API. Yeah. It just doesn't follow the spec.
Makes sense. Okay, so every time we have like a Drupal API, like JSON API client or JavaScript based show, we ask this question. I'm curious, do you think Drupal will ever ship with a headless front end theme?
Maybe. I am, constantly amazed by the sort of ingenuity of the Drupal community. So like, this is definitely possible. And one of the things that I've tried to do in all the front end work that I've done is like show some things that I know can be done, and then like not close any doors, basically. I don't want to ever say this thing can't be done, because I just don't agree with that whole attitude. Because I'm always proven wrong if I would try to do that. Like, yeah, Drupal community is great.
And I'm not sure how familiar you are with the new Starshot initiative. Do you think there's a place for Next.js or headless in general in Starshot? So Starshot was the initiative that Dries announced at the last DrupalCon. It's basically, it's meant to be a innovation accelerator, I think, like putting all the resources of Drupal. Like Drupal's been working on, the community's been working on a lot of really large initiatives now for a few years. And this is kind of just putting a lot of urgency to getting them across the line and providing the resources needed from companies. I think providing a little bit of red tape cutting maybe, and kind of doing it core adjacent, so that, we can kind of get kind of the deep changes that we may need to get some of this stuff in, but not be, hit by the core gates that sometimes prevent that level of innovation. So there's a lot of talk of putting, like, it's basically an opinionated Drupal, is the way I've seen it described. I think that's made sense for me. So like you when you install Starshot, you're going to have a component system. You're going to have Webform probably. You're going to have a way, like the opinionated way that the Drupal community has agreed is the best way to do something, and you just kind of a couple clicks install. So do you think headless has a place in that initiative?
I do, because I mean, like I said, I really do like Twig, but as a language, Twig is a nice language, but the lack of components is troublesome, right? And having a JavaScript front end has been proven, to me at least, a really good way of building any sort of front end, right? And I'm really pleased with how Drupal has been able to sort of keep up with the times and being a great CMS that can do all sorts of things, including being a backend for this decoupled front ends. So yeah, I don't see why it couldn't be part of Starshot.
And I think that that is going to be, I see a future where headless Drupal is a recipe. So you go and you install Starshot, you pick a recipe, and one of the recipes is like, the headless recipe. And of course, like that's a no-brainer to include then Drupal Next.js. So I think like, we're going to see all of these recipes, and then there could be a recipe that does something else, like with another JavaScript framework. And so I think that is really cool. I'm so sad that the time is almost over. So we're going to go to the final question. I think like we could have probably talked about this all day, but always, at least like this is my second show as a guest host, and I always try to find something interesting about the people we are talking to. And I saw something on your Drupal.org profile that you're the winner of the TPOTM, which is the trivial patch of the month. And this was in, I think, 15 years ago or something, in Drupal 7.
Sounds like it.
You made a commit that I think Webchick accepted that one. So what made this commit so amazing? And we are obviously going to put the link to the commit into the notes of the show, right? But can you tell us, like, what made this make you become a winner of the best patch of the month, or the most trivial patch of the month?
The most trivial patch of the month. And the thing is, this was never awarded again because my patch was the most trivial you can ever have. I was working on this. I don't even remember what the issue is, but you'll link to it. Doesn't really matter what the issue was. It was an issue that got added to Drupal 8, and then we backported it to Drupal 7. And when we backported it to Drupal 7, I wrote the backported patch. Somebody pointed out, hey, you've got a line of documentation or a code documentation that should end in a period because sentences should end in a period. They're like, oh, you're right. And I added the period to the Drupal 7 patch, and then somebody pointed out that meant that there is a regression in Drupal 8 where the period is missing. And so after we backported it successfully to Drupal 7, I wrote a patch saying this was a regression in Drupal 8 so that this code comment is missing a period. So I added the patch, and we were just being silly. And Webchick was like, she went and made me this graphic image that says trivial patch of the month and posted it to the issue queue when she committed. And yeah, that's
cool.
how I got it.
This is how you earned a core commit back in the days, right? No, just joking. Hey, this is so great. So yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. And you're still the holder of that award. So yeah,
I don't think it's possible to beat unless somebody figures out a way to add a space as a single change. That would beat it, or remove a space. I guess removing a space would also be pretty trivial.
Yes.
Well, thank you, John, for joining us. It's been a pleasure learning about Next.js with you.
It's been great talking about it. I guess one thing I would like to say is that Chapter 3 has been sponsoring me to work on Next Drupal, but I am looking for my next project. So if anybody is interested in decoupled stuff, I'm available.
Sounds good.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button. All right, John, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Email, honestly. John@albin.net, ALBIN.net. I do have Twitter, I guess, or whatever they call it now. But yeah, I still call it Twitter. I'm going to dead name it. At John Albin, but yeah, email works best.
Awesome. And Betty, how about you?
Yeah, so that's Patti Sonia on probably all of the portals. And of course, at DrupalCon Barcelona happening in September this year.
September. And John, how about you?
Very cool. You can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi, as well as Drupal.org. And you can find out more about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And if you have enjoyed listening, we have enjoyed talking. Have a good one, everyone.